The Statue of Liberty wasn't a welcoming mother in 1900. She was the bouncer to the most ruthless club on earth, and her front door was Ellis Island. For millions chasing the American dream in New York City, the Copper Lady held a torch, but the true sorting mechanism was a piece of white chalk. This was the dawn of the industrial boom, but the system had absolutely no use for the weak. You see, the ocean crossing took weeks, but the judgment that defined your entire existence took exactly 6 seconds. That was the duration of the infamous 6-second medical exam. As thousands of exhausted steerage passengers shuffled up the grand staircase of the Great Hall, doctors in crisp uniforms stood at the top, watching. They weren't looking for potential, they were hunting for liabilities. And the moment they spotted a limp, a wheeze, or a confused stare, the chalk came out. An E marked on the wool coat meant an eye condition, an X meant a suspected mental defect. That single, silent scratch of chalk was heavier than a judge's gavel. It meant immediate, unquestionable isolation. Imagine the paralyzing dread. You have sold everything you own, crossed an unforgetting ocean in the dark belly of a ship, only to have your family's timeline severed by a man who doesn't even know your name. A father is pulled to the right, while his weeping daughter is shoved to the left, destined for deportation. There were no negotiations. There were no second chances. The silence of those separated families echoed louder than the ocean itself. It was a 20% rejection rate for certain ship classes, creating a psychological terror that hung in the air like thick smoke. Every single immigrant knew that a blink at the wrong time could ruin generations. Imagine standing in that line, knowing a stranger's quick glance will dictate your entire family's destiny. Would your nerves hold up, or would the panic in your eyes give you away? Because this was the brutal reality of the New York 1900 immigration quotas, an efficiency machine designed to relentlessly filter human capital. But for the lucky ones who wiped away the chalk and made it onto the Manhattan ferry, they were about to realize the ocean crossing was the easy part, because a trap was waiting.
Part 2. The Dumbbell Trap. They were promised streets paved with gold, but the reality was a 400-square-foot windowless box in the Lower East Side. This was the ultimate bait-and-switch of the 20th century. The moment those ferry doors opened, the fresh ocean breeze was instantly replaced by an atmosphere so thick you felt you had to chew it. Welcome to the Dumbbell Tenement. This specific architectural failure was designed to maximize profit while aggressively minimizing human dignity. It was a trap built of cheap brick and quiet despair. By 1900, the Lower East Side had morphed into a pressure cooker, reaching a staggering density of 330,000 people per square mile. To put that into perspective, it was the highest concentration of humanity anywhere on the planet at that time. There was no personal space, only shared survival. You could hear your neighbors breathing, coughing, and weeping through the paper-thin walls. The sensory overload was entirely psychological, a creeping claustrophobia that never let up. In the dead of summer, the suffocating heat turned these unventilated boxes into literal ovens. The narrow air shafts between buildings, originally designed to provide light, instead became vertical dumping grounds. They trapped the stagnant air, filling the apartments with the inescapable sour stench of boiled cabbage, damp wool, and rotting garbage. It was a smell that clung to your skin and seeped into your soul. You couldn't wash it off, primarily because there was rarely any running water. Entire families, often multiple families, were crammed into a single, lightless room. Sleep was a luxury. Privacy was a total myth. Look around the room you're sitting in right now. Now imagine dividing it among 12 desperate strangers with no running water. How many days could you survive before breaking? This wasn't just poverty. It was a psychological endurance test meticulously engineered by landlords who lived far away in uptown mansions. The relentless noise of the streets below, the crying infants, the clattering carts, it all merged into a deafening symphony of desperation. You couldn't escape the building, and you couldn't escape the neighborhood. And just when the walls felt like they were literally closing in, a heavy knock on the door signaled the arrival of the one man you couldn't ignore, the rent collector. Part 3. The Time Theft Machine. The rent collector didn't just demand your money.
He demanded your hours, forcing immigrants into the relentless jaws of the 1900s sweatshop. Time was no longer something you lived, it was something you owed. If the tenement was the trap, the factory was the extraction machine. This wasn't a workplace, it was a time theft mechanism where the ticking clock was the loudest, most threatening voice in the room. You see, the economics of the garment industry in 1900 were built on a mathematical impossibility. The piece rate system meant you weren't paid for your time, you were paid fractions of a penny for each completed garment. The pressure was paralyzing. If you completed 100 shirts, you might eat. If your hands cramped and you only finished 90, your children went hungry. It was exactly that simple and exactly that brutal. Men, women, and teenagers routinely endured 14-hour workdays, hunched over wooden tables in rooms choked with thick fabric dust. They might earn $4 a week, while the rent for that miserable Dumbbell Tenement demanded $10 a month. Do the math. Every single penny earned was already spent before it even touched their calloused hands. The psychological weight of this impossible equation was heavier than the cast-iron machines they operated. The environment itself was designed to break you down. Imagine the deafening mechanical roar of 100 sewing machines firing at once. The vibration rattled your teeth. It drowned out the conversations. It drowned out the weeping. It drowned out even your own internal thoughts. You became a biological extension of the needle. Heavy eyelids fought a losing battle against the dim gaslight. Trembling hands pushed fabric closer and closer to the rapid-fire needle, knowing that a single mistake meant the piece was ruined and your day's wage was forfeited. Every drop of sweat was quantified. If you stopped sewing, you stopped eating. The machine dictated your heartbeat, punishing any organic weakness with immediate financial ruin. It was a slippery slope of exhaustion where severe sleep deprivation met the constant terror of total destitution. But the factory wasn't the only place waiting to extract its pound of flesh. The streets below had their own hidden tax, collected by familiar faces. The greatest predators on the streets of New York didn't speak English. They spoke the exact same dialect as their victims. This is the darkest, most twisted betrayal of the immigrant experience in 1900. You step off the boat completely overwhelmed by the chaotic, deafening noise of the Lower East Side. You are surrounded by millions of people, yet you are entirely, paralyzingly alone. The profound isolation of the language barrier was a weapon specifically used against the most vulnerable arrivals. Imagine standing on a bustling corner, desperate for work, when a well-dressed man approaches you. He smiles warmly. He speaks your mother tongue perfectly. He even knows the geography of your hometown. This was the Padrone system, and these men were the ultimate architects of misery. They were the dock runners who weaponized trust the very moment you cleared Ellis Island. They offered fake boarding houses that were actually extortion traps designed to drain your meager savings in days. They provided factory jobs or railroad work, but only if you accepted predatory loans with staggering 100% interest rates. It was a perfectly designed financial prison, built entirely by your own countrymen. The psychological horror of this realization was utterly devastating. You were being systematically swindled by the only faces that looked familiar in a terrifying new world. And the most chilling part? You had absolutely zero vocabulary to beg a police officer for help. Even if you managed to find an honest cop, your frantic pleas were just meaningless noise to him. You couldn't read the predatory contracts you signed. You couldn't read the street signs. Every single sound in the city was a potential threat. Trust became a fatal liability. A smile from a stranger speaking your mother tongue wasn't salvation. It was the bait for a trap. With their trust shattered and their pockets empty, these families had only one asset left to sell, and it was rapidly running out. The final asset they had to sell was their own bodies. But a silent, invisible killer was already waiting in the tenement air shafts. History calls it the White Plague, but to the desperate immigrants of 1900, it was simply the dark shadow that swallowed entire families whole. This wasn't a violent street crime or a sudden dramatic factory accident. It was tuberculosis, and in the sunless, unventilated slums of the Lower East Side, it found the absolute perfect breeding ground to multiply. It accounted for nearly 10% of all deaths in the United States at the time, but in these specific buildings, the concentration was historically catastrophic. The true horror wasn't found in blood or visceral gore. It was in the agonizingly slow decline of the human frame. It always started with a persistent, quiet cough in the dark. A mother lying awake on a thin mattress, listening to the heavy, rattling breath of her husband. She watches his strength drain away day by day, knowing she is completely powerless to stop the progression. He goes to the sweatshop exhausted, and he comes back a fraction of the man he was just a week prior. The tragedy is profound because a strong, capable body simply gives up without a single drop of spilled blood. There was no medicine for them. There was no pristine hospital bed waiting uptown. There was only the terrifying silence of the morning when the breadwinner simply cannot rise from the mattress. The financial engine of the family abruptly stops. Put yourself in their shoes. If working meant a slow, invisible end, but stopping meant your family starves tomorrow, which impossible choice do you make? They marched into the factories knowing the air was poison because hunger was a much faster executioner. When the adults fall, the survival of the bloodline shifts, falling heavily onto narrow shoulders that should be playing, not paying.
Part 6. The Coal Bucket Democracy. Before the children could be sent to the factories, fathers had to make a desperate deal with the devil, Boss Croker's Tammany Hall. You see, the government of New York City in 1900 didn't offer welfare, food stamps, or organized housing assistance. If you failed, you froze. That was the stark, undeniable reality of the urban winter. But into this desperate vacuum stepped the ultimate political machine, operating completely outside the bounds of traditional democracy. Tammany Hall bought loyalty not with grand, sweeping speeches about liberty, but with a literal bucket of winter coal. This was an absolute quid pro quo system that aggressively preyed on the poorest residents of the city. A ward boss would knock on your door in January, smiling, holding the vital fuel your family desperately needed to survive the night. He would offer you a meager job sweeping streets or hauling garbage. But the transaction was crystal clear. In exchange for that coal and that survival salary, you completely surrendered your political obedience. You voted exactly how they told you to vote. You attended the rallies they demanded you attend. The deep humiliation of this transaction cannot be overstated. A proud father who crossed an ocean to find freedom and autonomy was now trading away his moral compass and his agency just to keep his children's lips from turning blue. It was a profound psychological defeat. He became an owned asset of the machine. If you rebelled, the coal stopped, the job disappeared, and the eviction notice arrived. It was a mafia-style safety net. Survival was practically guaranteed, but the upfront price was your soul and your silence. But the political machine didn't just want the father's votes. The gears of the Industrial Revolution were already looking hungrily at their children. Part 7. The 4-foot fuel. The true fuel of the 1900 Industrial Revolution wasn't coal. It was under 4 feet tall and completely unprotected by law. You see, when the adults inevitably began to break down under the crushing weight of the slums, the economic engine of the city demanded a replacement. And that replacement came from the nursery. The grim, undeniable reality of the era was that over 1.7 million children under the age of 15 were actively swallowed by the workforce. This changes everything you know about the traditional family structure. These weren't teenagers working a summer job for pocket money. These were desperate 7, 8, and 9-year-olds stepping into the horrifying void left by a father suffering from the White Plague. They became the primary breadwinners overnight. Imagine the heavy, suffocating adult resignation settling into the eyes of an 8-year-old girl. She stands in the deafening roar of a textile mill, realizing with absolute certainty that she will never learn to read, never go to school, and never simply be a kid.
Her tiny, nimble fingers were highly valued by factory bosses because they could reach into jamming machinery to clear snags without stopping the production line. The danger was astronomical, but the pay was essential. Out on the freezing cobblestones, the situation was just as frantic. Thousands of newsies and messenger boys sprinted through the chaotic, carriage-choked avenues, dodging horses and streetcars to earn fractions of a cent. They ran, they shouted, they fought for corners. This relentless, exhausting pace was completely unnatural for a human frame that was still developing. But the psychological toll was even heavier than the physical labor. They carried the absolute terror that if they didn't sell their quota of papers, their younger siblings would not eat that night. Childhood was a luxury the American dream simply couldn't afford. They didn't play with toys, they were the cogs keeping the machine alive. Yet the hardest blow didn't happen on the factory floor. It happened at the dinner table, where a different kind of fracture was tearing families apart. Part 8. The Silent Dinner Table. The hidden tax of the American dream was paid at the dinner table, where children slowly became strangers to their own parents. This is the invisible tragedy that no ledger or census could ever capture. When these families sacrificed everything to board those ships, they believed their profound bond would be their ultimate shield against the harsh new world. But there is a crucial nuance. The public school system in 1900 had an explicit, ruthless mandate to aggressively Americanize the immigrant youth. Teachers were instructed to actively suppress foreign languages, erase old-world customs, and mold these children into standardized citizens. And it worked with devastating efficiency. Slowly, inevitably, a profound psychological chasm opened right in the middle of their cramped 400-square-foot tenements. Imagine the heartbreak of a mother who spends her exhausting day scrubbing floors, only to sit down at the dinner table and realize she can no longer effectively communicate with her own son. He answers her traditional questions in rapid, sharp English, a language that sounds like a locked door to her ears. He refuses to speak the old language. Worse still, a burning, quiet shame begins to fester. The children start to look at their parents' thick accents, their worn traditional clothes, and their old-world superstitions, not with respect, but with deep embarrassment. They want to fit in. They want to be Americans. That is exactly why they began to actively reject the very people who carried them across the ocean. The psychological alienation was profound. A father who was once the respected patriarch of his village was now viewed by his own kids as an ignorant relic of the past. There were no arguments, just a devastating, expanding silence as the cultural erasure took root. They crossed a deadly ocean just to stay together, only to have a new language build an invisible, impenetrable wall right in their living room. This invisible wedge, combined with the crushing poverty, pushed many to a breaking point that history books rarely mention. History loves to tell you about the ones who stayed, but it conveniently forgets the 30% who looked at the American dream and said, "I surrender." This is the massive, heavily guarded secret of the early 20th century. We're conditioned to believe the immigration narrative is a one-way street of triumph and perseverance, but that is simply not true. Between the years 1890 and 1914, nearly a third of all immigrants packed up their battered suitcases and fled right back to Europe. They were known by historians as the birds of passage, and their story reveals the absolute breaking point of the human spirit. Think about the sheer psychological devastation required to make that choice. You have to admit utter defeat. But before they broke, there was a quiet, agonizing ritual that took place in thousands of freezing tenement rooms, the lie of the letter. Imagine sitting in the damp dark, your hands shaking from a 14-hour factory shift, trying to hold a cheap pen. You are writing back to your village in Italy or Poland or Ireland. You force a massive, invisible smile into the ink. You write that the city is beautiful, that work is plentiful, and that everything is wonderful. You lie to protect your pride. You lie to protect the family name. You lie because the truth that you are starving in a windowless box is too humiliating to put on paper. But eventually, the dissonance between the myth they projected and the misery they endured snapped their resolve. The agonizing tension between their stubborn pride and the primal biological instinct to survive simply became too much. They chose the humiliation of retreating over the certainty of dying in the slums. Imagine the crushing defeat of packing your one suitcase, admitting the golden streets were a lie, and sailing back as a complete failure. But for the 70% who refused to break, who stayed and endured the unendurable, the final bill for the modern world was about to come due. The final bill wasn't paid in money. It was paid in generations, revealing the ultimate truth behind the American dream of 1900. When you strip away the romance and look at the brutal arithmetic of the era, a profound realization emerges. The immigrant experience of that time was not a failure. It was not a grand Ponzi scheme designed solely to crush the weak. It was, at its very core, an intentional, brutally calculated martyrdom. Those who stayed, those who survived the 6-second medical exams, the dumbbell tenements, and the suffocating sweatshops eventually came to a silent consensus. They knew, with a heavy, heartbreaking certainty, that the glittering promise of the American dream was never actually meant for them. Their bodies were already broken. Their lungs were already scarred. Their accents would always mark them as outsiders. But they didn't stop. That is exactly why their story is so incredibly powerful. They possessed a quiet, stoic nobility that defies modern comprehension. The first generation willingly walked into the flames. They allowed themselves to be consumed by the unforgiving fire of industrialization so that their second generation could finally stand up straight without a cough. They shattered their own spines so their third generation could go to college, enter the middle class, and eventually own the very furnaces that once burned their grandfathers. It was a strategy of delayed gratification that spanned over 50 years. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, the sprawling middle-class suburbs, the entire economic foundation of the 20th century, none of it was built on magic. It was forged in the silent exhaustion of millions of nameless workers who traded their own futures for their bloodline's survival. They were the foundational ghosts of the modern era. Every modern luxury we enjoy today was bought with their unrecognized blood, sweat, and silence. So the next time you look up at the glittering skyline of New York, ask yourself, could you have paid the price they paid, or would the city have swallowed you whole? But to portray 1900 New York as only a slaughterhouse would be a half-truth that misses the most vital electric ingredient of the era, the sheer, unyielding alchemy of hope. In the very shadow of the Dumbbell Tenements, a parallel infrastructure of mercy was beginning to take root. This was the birth of the settlement house, oases of sanity where visionaries like Lillian Wald offered more than just soup. They offered a blueprint for dignity. They provided clean milk for infants, vocational training for fathers, and a safe harbor for mothers. This wasn't just charity, it was a strategic counter-offensive against the slums. Simultaneously, the city was building palaces for the people, magnificent free libraries where a boy who spent 10 hours sorting coal could step into a cathedral of marble and silent books. In those reading rooms, he realized for the first time that his mind was a territory the factory could never own. This was the ladder of ascent. It often started with a single pushcart on Hester Street, a grueling 12-hour-a-day gamble, but for the relentless, that pushcart evolved into a small storefront, then a wholesale business, then a family legacy. The city was a brutal machine, yes, but it was also the world's most aggressive social elevator. Free night schools hummed with the sound of exhausted adults learning a new grammar by candlelight, refusing to be mere victims of a system. For every family crushed by the White Plague, another was clawing its way into the light, fueled by a terrifyingly powerful belief that their current misery was merely the down payment on a future they couldn't yet see. This friction between absolute despair and radical hope is where the modern soul was forged. The city didn't just break people, it tested them, and for those who didn't shatter, it offered a prize that was unavailable anywhere else on Earth: the chance to stop being a ghost of the past and start being the architect of a new world.